All right, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. I see a few people are still trickling in, but we're going to kick things off. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited for today's conversation, and it's even more exciting to see all of your faces here on this event. So thank you for being here at a Wednesday morning event with us this morning. My name is Thomas Godwin. My pronouns are they and them, and I work with SAGE. SAGE is a national organization that provides services and advocacy for LGBTQ+ elders across the country. Specifically, I work with SAGE's National LGBTQ+ Elder Housing Initiative, otherwise known as the National Housing Initiative, or sometimes we just call it the NHI. At the NHI, we are committed to supporting and uplifting inclusive and affordable housing for LGBTQ+ elders nationally. I will be your event MC with us this morning today, and I can't wait to get started. If you need closed captionings for this event, you can enable the closed captioning button on this Zoom call. It should be enabled already, but if you are having trouble with it, just let us know in the chat and we can get things sorted out. And if you're having any other technical difficulties with your video, with sound, with audio, we encourage you to hop off the Zoom call, join back on the same link, and see if that helps. And if that doesn't help, please try to message us in the chat and let us know what's going on, and somebody will try to assist you. We're here today to discuss LGBTQ+ older adult housing in Pennsylvania. You will hear more about this from our speakers and our panelists. But LGBTQ+ older adults experience disproportionate rates of housing insecurity and housing discrimination, especially when compared to their non-LGBTQ+ counterparts. The NHI was founded at SAGE as a response to the national housing crisis experienced by LGBTQ+ older adults across the country. This crisis is certainly at play in the state of Pennsylvania, and there are many efforts across the state to help address this need for our community. So we'll get to hear about some of those today. Alex, if you can go to the next slide. So we're going to quickly go over our agenda for today. Today we'll begin by hearing from a few speakers. Our first speaker will highlight some of SAGE's work across the country and will introduce the National Housing Initiative. Our second speaker will assess the need for LGBTQ+ inclusive housing services in the state of Pennsylvania. And after our two speakers, we'll hear from our panel of community and professional leaders at the intersection of LGBTQ+ advocacy and housing. After our panel, we'll take a short 10-minute break. This is a 3-hour event, so having a nice break in there for us to get some water, take a breath, use the restroom, that type of thing. After our break, we'll come back together and we will go into breakout sessions, learning more about specific ways that we can support LGBTQ+ older adults in the Pennsylvania community. You can go to the next slide, Alex. Before we dive into this agenda, I want to take a moment to thank our event partners. From the start of our planning for this event, these partners have provided integral feedback and support at every step along the way. The William Way Community Center, the Persaud Center, the Philadelphia Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs, the Western Pennsylvania Advocacy Team, and Presbyterian Senior Care have been dedicated partners in the planning of this event. We're so grateful. It could not have happened without them. Additionally, this event was made possible by the generous support of the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation. We at SAGE are always grateful for their consistent commitment to supporting LGBTQ+ equality for older adults. Alex, you can go to the next slide. So now we can get started with our lovely program. We're going to begin by offering a brief overview of SAGE's national work and the work of the National Housing Initiative to support LGBTQ+ older adults. You can go to the next slide, Alex. Our first speaker is Sydney Kopp-Richardson, who uses she and her pronouns. Sydney is the director of the National LGBTQ+ Elder Housing Initiative at SAGE. The National Housing Initiative is working to reshape the housing landscape nationally and to increase the availability of safe LGBTQ+ affirming elder housing. Previously, Sydney worked in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York City in direct service, organizing and advocacy, and policy analysis around housing, houselessness, HIV, and health access. Through an anti-racist framework, Sydney aims to center the needs of survivors, people involved in the justice system, people living with mental health challenges, and others living in the margins. Sydney has developed an anti-violence curriculum and policy recommendations for LGBTQ+ communities and infuses this into her housing work. She enjoys Chicago pizza and long walks with her partner and baby Merle. Sydney, we're so excited to have you today.
Thank you so much. I didn't realize how long that bio would be. Thank you. Thomas, thank you once again for organizing this amazing event. I'm so excited to see so many people here. This has taken so much work and planning, and thank you again to all the partners that made this happen. Next slide, please, Alex. So I think that folks are generally familiar with SAGE, but I'll do just a brief intro. SAGE has been around since 1978. And is the country's largest and oldest org dedicated to improving the lives of LGBTQ+ older adults, working to achieve a high quality of life for our community, for our elders, supporting and advocating for their rights, fostering a greater understanding of aging in all communities, and promoting positive images of LGBTQ+ elders in later life years. Next slide, please. So SAGE conducts a range of activities. We do policy advocacy, we provide home and community-based services, we host the National Resource Center on LGBTQ+ aging, we provide a wide range of consumer education pieces. We also host our SAGE Care Credentialization and Training Program. We have developed a new long-term care equality index, and we also engage in national and international partnerships and coalitions. And SAGE is also the home to the National LGBTQ+ Elder Housing Initiative, or as Thomas mentioned, the NHI. Next slide, please. So we know that affordability and safety are challenges for LGBTQ+ communities as we age. The lack of data on LGBTQ+ aging does not account for our communities, but we know that despite common narratives of affluence, LGBTQ+ elders experience disproportionate rates of poverty, housing instability, and physical and mental and cognitive health decline. And we know that there are a lot of root causes of this. Some examples are the pathways to affordable housing, such as homeless shelters or different kind of medical systems are unsafe and create not only exacerbated barriers, but invisibility of the needs amongst LGBTQ+ elders. Finding long-term care or retirement communities can be especially challenging for queer elders, and most long-term care communities lack LGBTQ+ inclusive non-discrimination policies. And despite progressive progress, and also amidst a cultural backlash that we're seeing in this country right now, LGBTQ+ people lack basic legal protections in states across the country, so including consistent and explicit anti-discrimination protections, particularly with housing. We also see the legacies of discrimination at systemic and employment and healthcare levels that have cumulative effects on us as we age, as we get older. So for example, if you're someone who has survived violence at the hands of medical providers, such as transphobia or practices like conversion therapy, this can make someone less likely to engage in their medical care and their medical systems to fully address healthcare needs, and can really catch up with someone as they are getting older. The cumulative impact of all of this directly affects long-term health and access to safe, affordable housing as LGBTQ+ people age. So next slide, please. Keeping all of this in mind, since 2015, the NHI has provided technical assistance and public education around developing safe, affirming, affordable housing nationally, and serving as a model for best practices and resources for region-specific advocates, service providers, housing developers, and our communities. The 5 key strategies of the NHI include building housing, changing policy, educating consumers, expanding services, and training providers, community orgs, and housing developers nationally. And we will share with you some information about our trainings in a little bit. And LGBTQ plus affirming, when we say that, it can sound maybe jargony, but you'll hear the words are LGBTQ plus affirming or LGBTQ plus friendly housing. And it's a growing model that's serving a swiftly growing market and population. And all this means is really housing that provides a welcoming environment of community, of peers, of allies that often includes voluntary, culturally competent services. And I know Ed will talk more explicitly about what is happening in Pennsylvania in a minute. Next slide, please. Oops, sorry, that was backslide. So just some of the resources that the NHI provides, and we can share this all in our follow-up information. We have a primer called Understanding the Affordable Housing Development Primer, and this showcases models of LGBTQ plus affirming across the country, including the John C. Anderson apartments that we'll talk about today, as well as the journey that people took to get there and the key components of the housing development process. I think it can sometimes feel a bit looming and people don't always know where to start. So we really walk you through pre-ideation all the way through construction and lease up. And give you some tools around that. We have an NHI toolkit that also provides resources on different components of housing development, anything from affirming marketing strategies under fair housing law to the low-income housing tax credit to cultural humility and competency working with LGBTQ plus people and intersectional communities like people coming from shelter. So there's a wide range of kinds of topics that we provide resources on in that toolkit. We provide people connections to financing support, such as national syndicators, like our partners at the National Equity Fund. We have developed new trainings for developers. We have symposia and regional roundtables such as this, and we provide one-on-one technical assistance to help people strategize and to plan building housing. And with that, I will turn it back to Thomas.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sydney, for offering us that overview of SAGE and the NHI to start us off for this event. After looking at that sort of national SAGE impact perspective, we're going to transition now to discuss the specific needs of LGBTQ plus elders in Pennsylvania, and also the work that's currently being done in the state to support this community. So I'm really excited to introduce you all to our next speaker, who's going to talk to us about the specific needs of the community in Pennsylvania. This speaker, Ed Miller, uses he and him pronouns. Ed is the Senior Programs Manager at the William Way LGBT Community Center, where his responsibilities extend to include supportive services at the John C. Anderson LGBT-friendly apartments, which Sydney mentioned earlier. Ed's priority is offering consistent and meaningful social engagement programs for LGBTQ plus older adults, providing opportunities to be in community and to connect with service providers and resources. Ed is a recipient of the Sage Ken Dawson Leadership Award for Community Engagement, where he is focused on developing and strengthening partnerships on behalf of LGBTQ plus elders. Ed, thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to hear from you today, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm really happy to be here. If Alex could go to the next slide, I'm going to dive right in and talk about social isolation and a little bit about housing discrimination and the cumulative effect. So many of us have experienced social isolation during the pandemic and know what that isolation feels like and what it's like to be lonely. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that feels like when you're an LGBT elder early on in your life, coming up and then experiencing that to some degree through your life. LGBT elders came up, in a time where there was great discrimination and prejudice against them back in the 20s and 30s. And, even today, especially in Pennsylvania, you could lose your job, you could be injured or ridiculed discrimination played a really big role in not being able to advance through the work system. And so what we found is that LGBT seniors, didn't reach the financial impact that they could have had if they were heterosexual. So a little bit about the nucleus of friendships. So we all sort of build our friendships and our close relationships, and some of us keep those friendships all through our lives. LGBTQ seniors created those groups of friendships, not only to be friends, but also to be to feel safe and be able to be themselves. And a lot of them were distanced from their biological families because they weren't accepted, and so they really depended on this nucleus of friends. And what we see and everybody sees is when you go through like that nucleus of friends, whether people move into retirement homes or move into a warmer climate or find the love of their lives, and some people pass away, and so that nucleus of friendship sort of dwindles. And some of the statistics that SAGE uses is that 4 times that LGBT seniors are 4 times less likely not to have children, and they are 4 times less likely and twice as likely to live alone. So that makes it very difficult to live their lives and to stay to age in place. So as time goes on, back to this nucleus of friends, we see that heterosexual people are, they are expanding their families, they have children, and so we don't see that in the LGBT seniors. So that network of support, I think 80% of caregivers in the country today are children of seniors, and that gap exists for LGBT seniors, and it makes it very difficult to learn more about the resources that they have to age in place. Another piece of information about coming up as an LGBT elder, it wasn't until 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association declared that being homosexual was not a disease. So so what I think the point is that, we all have baggage that we carry through our lives, and we hear this term sometimes that LGBT seniors have unique needs. And when you compile, this social isolation and this prejudice that people have had, along with being separated from their biological families, that's what we're talking about. It's the unique needs. We need better support systems, and we need to be aware of what they've gone through in their lives and why they do need to be, why people need to be educated about that. So as far as housing discrimination, we know that 25% of transgender individuals and 48% of same-sex couples experience housing discrimination based on their perceived sexual orientation and or gender identity. Many states do not offer legal protections against housing. So in Pennsylvania, that's still, we're making a lot of progress, but it's still, we're still waiting for statewide protections of LGBTQ people. And so I know about this study where heterosexuals would go into an apartment building and ask to see an apartment, a 1-bedroom apartment. And, the property manager was very open and willing to show them an apartment and show them a model apartment and give them an application. And then a few hours later, a couple perceived to be gay came in with the same request, and they were told that there were no 1-bedroom apartments available, and they were taking applications at this moment. And so we see that this continues, this discrimination is happening even today. And so that's all the more reason why we need to be educated and aware of how we can be welcoming and supportive of LGBT seniors. So over the years, people have not had the opportunities that heterosexual people have had. in housing, in job opportunities, and staying connected with your biological families and having children to support them. And what happens is, can't see this slide. Oh, okay. So my point was that just, there's all these things result in disproportionate legacies of financial stress and homelessness in LGBTQ seniors. There's an important needs assessment that was done, and we can go to the next slide, that the Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center was really took under their wing and did a lot of work on making that needs assessment available, and along with PHMC. And some of the statistics that came out of that needs assessment were that 14% of LGBTQ people have experienced homelessness, 28% not making enough to make ends meet, 10% worry that food will run out, 23% describe their health as poor or fair. And the point is, and this whole survey is available on Bradbury Sullivan's website, but the point is that if people, there are people that think LGBTQ people are have this status symbol, they have wealth, and they don't have to worry about these things. And so this survey is showing us again that that's not always the case, and so all the more reason why housing is important, for affordable housing is important. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the John C. Anderson apartments. So we have developed housing in Philadelphia. In 2014, the John C. Anderson LGBT friendly apartments were built, and Jim Pfeiffer is going to talk a little bit about the new exciting Pittsburgh development that's in progress. And then we're going to end up with just a little bit about how important community connections are through this whole housing process. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So here is the a picture of the John C. Anderson apartments. It's on 13th Street. It's right around the corner from the community center. And on the side of the building, it says John C. Anderson Apartments, an LGBT friendly community. And I think that's really an important sign, because we do try to build community within the apartments among the residents. And we do a lot to offer opportunities for the community to come in and to use the space, to have intergenerational programming, and to really feel like they can come in and be a part of the community. So it's really been an experience to see that all happen. So the building opened in 2014. It has 56 units, and we have 6 floors. We have a great courtyard. In fact, it's won 3 blue ribbons from the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. A little shout out to the gardeners who made that happen. And we have a case manager that's on site every other week and available, every day by phone or email. And she does a fabulous job of making sure that people are aware and have access to all the resources and supports that they are entitled to. I'm there a couple of days a week, and right around the corner, so I'm jumping in and out of there a lot. So birthday parties and informational presentations, and we just had a fun Halloween party and or a pumpkin painting contest or something that was really fun. The property is income restricted to 60% below the AMI. There's a property manager, and I run the supportive services as a part of the community center. So we're just super proud of the residents. And on the top left-hand corner there, you'll see a picture of the book club before the pandemic, and that's out in the garden. I was walking by and just saw all of those great people, and just want to shout out there to the right, that long-haired guy in the white long hair. His name is John James, and he was actually living in Washington, D.C. in 1965 and heard about the Reminder Days, which is, it was a protest march that took place, and they took place more than just on this particular day, but there was a protest march around Independence Mall, and he took a bus down to Philadelphia and was in the protest march. And there's a picture of him that we didn't even know it was him until he let us know. So to have him living at the apartment building, we didn't even know of his early advocacy and gutsy move to come in and do that protest. His sign had homosexuals are citizens, and I thought it was a really nice. It's really a treat to have him there at the John C. Anderson apartment. So I think that's all. I'm gonna pass it over to Jim Pfeiffer, who's going to talk about the new exciting work being done in Pittsburgh.
Great, thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this new project. Just briefly, want to say that this is about a 5.5-year effort on the part of our organization to try to build an LGBTQ friendly community in Pittsburgh. Presbyterian Senior Care is a 90-year-old nonprofit faith-based organization, and we currently serve about 6,500 seniors in Western Pennsylvania. We have 32 affordable housing communities that serve a little over 2,000 folks a year. And through some of our diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we were doing with the Persad Center, we were presented with the idea of developing Western Pennsylvania's first LGBTQ affordable housing community, and so we started doing some research around that, and actually found John C. Anderson Apartments. So, thank you, Ed. We toured there about 4 years ago. And then through some connections with the National Equity Fund, toured another community in Chicago called Town Hall Apartments, and really became intrigued with the model and the idea of doing something in Pittsburgh. And then through the generosity of the UPMC health system, we actually got a parcel of land donated in the Oakland area of Pittsburgh. If you're familiar with Pittsburgh, Oakland is where the University of Pittsburgh is. So it's actually a fabulous real estate location, walking distance to the universities, health systems, great real estate location. We developed a model, and you see the picture here, 52 units, 7 2 bedrooms, 45 1-bedroom apartments that were developed in, I think, a very attractive building that would fit into the Oakland environment. And we were absolutely delighted to find out in November that we received 9% low-income housing tax credits to begin the development of this project. And to Sydney's points before, putting one of these together is sort of not for the faint of heart. We'll probably have 6 or 7 different funding sources in order to make this affordable housing community work, including connections with the Urban Redevelopment Authority in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Housing Authority, and others. But absolutely worth the effort to do this. 30 of our units at a minimum will be dedicated to people under 50% median income, and the remainder of the units will be devoted to folks under 80% median income. So our schedule at this point is that we are now that we've been awarded the credits, we are going to work on final design and also establish an LGBTQ advisory committee to help us look at the programming and how we approach moving forward with the marketing of this community, as well as establishing a final name for the development. And if all goes well, we will be under construction in Pittsburgh by the end of the summer, and hopefully open in the late fall of 2024. PERSED will continue to be a partner with us in this project. We'll have an office space available for them. We'll have an on-site service coordinator available several days a week to help support the residents who live in this community. And then they will also have an opportunity, if needed, to access the services within our continuum of care. So we have home and community-based services, nursing and assisted living communities. And at the same time, we're working with SAGE. We're putting 1,000 of our employees, about 1,600 employees, we're putting 1,000 of our employees through the SAGE training as a part of this development. And we're really working to make all of our communities more LGBTQ friendly. So it's really been a privilege for me personally to work on this project the last 5 years. And we'll look forward, Jeff, to learning more and hopefully cooperating more with some of the communities that have been developed nationally to learn the lessons of how we navigate fair housing marketing plans and other things. So we're excited to work with Sydney and Sage and others as we really try to make this the most culturally competent community we can in the Pittsburgh region. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about it.
Thanks. All right. Thanks, Jim. I'm going to go to the next slide. That is really exciting, and it brings back the memories of it. Was fortunate for me to be at the community center when this project in Philadelphia was taking place, and Penrose set up their lease-up office in the community center. So we got to see all of the people coming in to get information, and there were boards up that showed the apartments, and the construction people and the designers and architects were meeting. And so it was just the buzz around having an LGBT friendly affordable apartment building in Philadelphia was amazing. And the point is that, you know, when I was experiencing all that, it's very easy to see that it was not just, you know, the developer deciding to build a building. It took, you know, work on the tax credits that didn't come through the first time. Certainly, we have a fantastic relationship with the Pennsylvania Department of Aging. The Penrose Properties is still very much involved and a part of the John C. Anderson Apartments. Of course, the funders, we had federal funding in state and city. The city of Philadelphia actually, the first go round, we moved our, the plan was moved. So they needed to find a new site, and the city of Philadelphia donated the space, the land that it's in now. So that was a really nice fit, and very much appreciated through when we were trying to look for new space. I say we as, you know, if I was doing anything there, but so the community engagement is really what I think built this building. You know, there was the vision and the funding, and so, but having everybody involved at every step of the way, and, you know, the town meetings that took place in Philadelphia about housing, about the tax credits, and you know, some were, you know, challenging. The community was challenging a lot of the you know, wanted to know a lot more information than they had, and so it was always, you know, and everybody was tied into what was going on, and that's what I think made the building a success, and still, you know, a proud place to live in Philadelphia. So I just want to thank everybody for the time here, and to wish you luck if you are in deciding to build a building especially in Pennsylvania. We would love to help in any way we can in Philadelphia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ed and Jim, for offering us some more context to what is happening in Pennsylvania around the work and the buildings, but also around the need for the community in terms of housing. In hearing what you talked about, Ed, I was just thinking about how there is such a great impact, like you were talking about, of these cumulative things like discrimination and financial insecurity and housing insecurity that have been piled upon LGBTQ plus communities for decades and decades. And our elders within the community are people who have lived through this continuous piling of financial insecurity and housing insecurity. And we're still in this day and age where violence against the community is still present. I mean, thinking about the current context of recent events, and it's really encouraging for me to hear about the beautiful work being done at the John C. Anderson Apartments and at Oakland, thinking about the context of all of the violence that the community's experienced and all of the historical trauma that the community's elders have experienced. It's really, really encouraging to hear about the buildings and the work being done in those buildings. So thank you for sharing, and thank you for offering us context. Now I want to open the floor to questions from the audience for Ed, for Jim, and also for Sydney if folks have questions on SAGE and the National Housing Initiative. So if you have a question, feel free to post it in the chat and we'll be monitoring the chat. Or you can unmute yourself and say them out loud. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can before we go into the next portion of our event. So I'll open the floor to questions now. I see we already have a question from Kim in the chat. Kim said, how many applications did it take for the Oakland project to be funded by the PHFA? So I will hand that question over to Jim with the Oakland work.
Sorry, I had a little trouble unmuting there. Actually, we got funded the first time. So that was a big surprise to us, and we were deeply blessed by that. Have to say, the key for us was making political connections early, and we found a champion in Senator Jay Costa, and a couple of board members, also. So being able to get funded in the first round was an unexpected and terrific opportunity for us. So we have 9 tax credit projects. We've actually had 8 of those 9 funded in the first round, but that's atypical. So if you're looking at that, it's much more typical to have to go in twice, but we were very fortunate to get funded first time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. I see another question about wondering if there are efforts outside of Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. I'm not sure, Ed or Jim, if you know of any, but if not, that's totally fine. But people are curious, particularly about Northwest Pennsylvania.
I'm not currently aware of anything, though we have a presence in Erie County. We have a couple of communities in Erie, and we have talked about the possibility of trying to do something in Erie in the future if this project comes to fruition for us. We kind of stay in the 17 counties on the west end, so that's the area I'm most familiar with.
Thanks, Jim. We've got more questions coming in. Ed, could you speak a little bit about the services provided by the William Way Community Center for the John C. Anderson Apartments?
Yeah, sure. We the senior programs at the community center are known as the Elder Initiative, and myself and David Griffith run a whole host of programs and presentations, and we have a connection with Jefferson University doing a lot of health education, and we try to bring all of those programs that we have over to John C. Anderson. We have a great a men's group that meets every week that we have great relationships with GOAL, which is the Gay Officers Action League. They're coming into John C. Anderson to help stock our pantry there during the holidays. But mostly, you know, I have like the monthly birthday party is always a big success. So we celebrate anybody's birthday that's taking place in the month, you know, in each month. We're having a large buffet, holiday celebration, or next week we're gonna trim the tree. So the idea is to just keep people in community as they age, try to get people out of their apartments and engage with one another and with the community. During the pandemic and the years since, we had a large food and nutrition program where we were bringing fresh fruit and produce into John C. Anderson every other week. And on the bye weeks, we were providing a hot meal to the seniors. That we just got that grant again. I just found out yesterday that grant was approved for this year. So very soon, or next year. So very soon, we're going to be moving that back into John C. Anderson, which is just, you know, it has everything. It builds community. It's food sharing, it's recipes, and it's just been a delight. So we're thrilled to get that large grant again. So, and as I said, the gardening is a big hit. There's a Friday night group of people that come together and they play mahjong or cards or watch a movie, and it just, yeah. So people, and the book club, and a lot of you know, there's Action Wellness does a weekly support group on virtually, where you know, people just call in, and there's a facilitator from Action Wellness. I'm sorry, so Jewish Family Services. But yeah, there's a whole host of things that are a lot of one-off celebrations. Just had a large fundraiser in the garden in the summer. It was lovely. And the caveat, I should say, like early on, we have these community engagements, and early on the residents said, yeah, we love to have these parties and have people come in, but we're invited to all these parties. And so it's fun to tell people that, you know, that the seniors are going to be coming to their party, and everybody loves that, and it's great fun. So.
Thank you, Ed. I really appreciate that. I also noticed a question in the chat about some concerns around faith-based programming. I'm going to toss that question to Sydney, who I know can speak some to this as well.
Yeah, so I think this can be a really sensitive, right, conversation as someone who identifies as queer and also has, you know, knows religious harm that's committed in communities and in families. I want to honor that there has been a legacy of violence committed against LGBTQ plus people in the name of various religious beliefs. And there are certainly, you know, organizations that we would need to vet. But I also want to acknowledge that there are religious groups and orgs founded in principles of care and love. And these are the types of religious organizations that SAGE aims to uplift and support as being true to, you know, the foundation of goodness and care and love. So I also, you know, I think it's the both and want to just recognize institutional harm that has been committed, while also knowing that there are groups that we have worked with and continue to work with that are truly rooted in justice and equity. And that's the type of kind of organization that we would hope to stay connected with.
Yeah, and I would just say too, and I know I mentioned our faith-based heritage in my comments, but we do not typically, you know, try to introduce any type of faith-based programming in our affordable housing communities. You know, we're not connected to any church groups or whatever. We will sort of, it's a bad way to say it, but we will allow the residents or empower the residents, however we want to say it. If they want spiritual programming, you know, we will try to connect them. But I think it's a very, very dangerous kind of, you know, track from my perspective to try to impose any type of, you know, religious programming into any of our communities. So we try to resist that. I would just say that, you know, our board tends to be a faith-based group, but we had fabulous, 100% unanimous support for this. They thought it was totally in line with our mission. And I was just so proud of our board for, how they dealt with this as we walked through, this process. But I think you have to be very careful, particularly if you get any HUD funding or federal funding, to be careful about, your faith-based programming in general. And to me, that needs to be something that's generated from the resident population, themselves in each community, if and when they choose to do that.
Thank you for speaking more to that, both Sydney and Jim. We are going to take this last question I see in the chat really quickly before moving on. The last question in the chat is from an individual in Harrisburg who sees a need for this type of development in Harrisburg. And he's just asking what you suggest is the first step to making strides towards this type of development. So if somebody wants to hop in and talk about the first step here, that would be wonderful.
I'll hop in real quick, just to say that I think the real key is finding a housing provider that has experience in doing this kind of programming. So Presbyterian Senior Care, Penrose, folks who have been funded for these types of projects many times are the organizations that typically, continue to get funded. So I'm not sure exactly who serves the Harrisburg area from a housing perspective. But what I think, tends to be the most effective is you find an experienced housing provider as well as an experienced service provider, a group who's, currently serving the LGBT community, and kind of partner those two organizations. Because when you're going for fund, if in fact you're going for any type of state or federal funding, one of the key criteria is that the organizations have done it before, they've done it successfully before, and they have a good track record. So finding out kind of who does the best affordable housing in Harrisburg, and then second step, obviously finding a great site. So those are the two things that we've seen as a way to kind of help make things successful. And Ed or Sydney might have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, Harrisburg has a great LGBTQ plus community, and a lot of the work being done up there is terrific. So, I mean, I would love to meet with Barry and just talk a little bit about what I know and who I know that I could connect you with. Of course, Sage has, the NHI has, so much excellent information and toolkits to get started. But yeah, I would be happy to make some human connections, maybe Penrose Properties or Mark Siegel, who had the vision of this building in Philadelphia. So certainly would love to come over to Harrisburg or to talk on the phone. It would be wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ed and Jim, for sharing that. And I also see some details about this Harrisburg question being posted in the chat. So feel free to look at the chat at this conversation. Unfortunately, we do need to move on to the next portion of our event. I just want to give a big thank you again to Sydney and Ed and Jim for giving us more background on SAGE and the national and statewide work that's happening to support LGBTQ plus older adults. We're so grateful for you all being here and taking the time. So thank you so much. And Alex, if you'll go to the next slide. We are very excited to move into our community panel for this event. So this section of the roundtable will focus on LGBTQ plus housing advocacy work happening across the state and even in some other areas of the country. We are very excited to introduce our lovely panelists for this conversation to you today. You can go to the next slide, Alex. Our first panelist is Renessa Edwards, who uses she and her pronouns. Renessa is a human relations representative with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, otherwise known as the PHRC, and her primary duties are to supervise investigations of complaints and discrimination, as well as to facilitate trainings and educate the community about unlawful discrimination. Renessa has spent the last 16 years in human service as a civil servant for the Pennsylvania state government. Upon graduating from the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown, Renessa worked as a behavioral specialist for a nonprofit organization and a youth studies counselor for the City of Philadelphia's Youth Studies Center. In these roles, Renessa often mentored youth who identified as members of the LGBTQ+ community. Renessa began her civil service career as an income maintenance caseworker for the PA Department of Public Welfare. She was then promoted to a corrections counselor for the Department of Corrections and now serves in her current capacity at the PHRC. In 2018, the PHRC approved sexual orientation as a protected class, which fueled Renessa's passion about fighting discrimination for all of the protected classes, including those with which she personally identifies. Renessa currently resides in Philadelphia with her wife and life partner of 17 years, along with their 18-month-old daughter. We're really happy to have you here today, Renessa. And Alex, if you'll go to the next slide. Our next panelist is Kim Crowder, who uses she and her pronouns. Kim is the Director of Development in Pennsylvania for the Walters Group, a housing development organization that has a national reach. Kim comes to this conversation today with over 30 years of experience in senior housing and over 15 years of experience in Pennsylvania affordable housing. Kim is the project manager for the first Innovation in Design award-winning project in Pennsylvania. Additionally, she has experience in operations, property management, and in successfully challenging zoning issues. She is known for being creative in developing innovative, inexpensive critical services for seniors and adults with disabilities to help them age in place with dignity and grace. Kim is particularly passionate about advocating for people with disabilities. Welcome, Kim. We're so glad to have you. And Alex, if you'll go to the next slide. Our last panelist is Ephraim Gaetahun, who uses he and him pronouns. Ephraim is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Training at Open House San Francisco. Open House San Francisco is an organization that specifically supports LGBTQ+ older adults in advocacy and services. Though Ephraim does not work directly in Pennsylvania, he was raised in the state and has close personal ties to this work. Ephraim entered his first non-clinical role after being presented with the opportunity to turn aging services inside out. Ephraim's roots began in hospice and dementia-related geriatric nursing, contending with his lived identities in a clinical world that was not designed to care for people like him. LGBTQ+ elders are experiencing a devastating phenomenon where they are re-entering the closet to mitigate persecution and harm because of who they are. Ephraim's work is deeply personal to him as he enters the existing infrastructure to become inclusive to all people, especially the aging queer community. Welcome, Ephraim. We're so excited to have you all. Alex, if you could stop sharing the slides for our panel portion, and we will get started with our conversation. Welcome, Renessa and Kim and Ephraim. We are so excited to have you here. And we're going to start off today by asking you to briefly provide us with an overview of your work and how it connects to LGBTQ+ older adult housing. We'd also love to hear about your connection to Pennsylvania and what that means to you as well. So we're going to hear from each of you on this question. And Renessa, why don't we start with you, if that's okay?
That's perfectly fine. Thanks, Tom, for inviting me to be on this panel with all of the wonderful presenters here. I'm honored to be a part of this. I represent the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We are the leading civil rights enforcement agency in Pennsylvania. We work to ensure that all Pennsylvanians can live, work, and learn free from discrimination. We are governed by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, which is Pennsylvania law that prohibits discrimination in the areas of education, public accommodation, employment, and housing. So as it relates to LGBTQ+ elders in housing, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act has protections which ensure that residents are not discriminated against due to the protected classes, such as race, color, religious creed, national origin, ancestry, familial status, sex, age, disability, and that includes the use, the use and training of a support animal. And so, as it was stated in my bio, that Pennsylvania Human Relations particularly included, or in 2018, we included the subsections of gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation into the already existing protected class of sex, so that we can ensure and sort of manipulate the law a little bit to include that protections for those in the LGBTQIA+ communities. And more recently, we have introduced regulations or an amendment to our regulations to specifically include and codify those laws to include those protections for those protected classes. And so we're waiting any moment now to have that included in our regulations, which would change the, what you've heard from the other presenters, that Pennsylvania doesn't have a particular law to protect LGBTQIA individuals. The PHRA will soon be able to explicitly do that, but as of right now, we are accepting complaints from individuals who believe they were discriminated against based on that protected class, like I said, to include sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity, transgender status, and we just currently include it into our protected class of sex. And so I have been with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission for going on 7 years, and I started out as a housing investigator where we received lots of complaints for those who feel they were discriminated against based on their protected class of sex, to include sexual orientation, gender status, transgender status, but also age, which is anyone who is in the age group of 40+. And so we understand that if those two protected classes are compounded, the discrimination is double. And then, of course, if you include the intersectionality of race and disability, unfortunately, those discriminations just compound, as those who spoke before me talked about. So I don't want to get too much into some of the other questions that you're going to present, but that's our connection and my connection to the Pennsylvania Citizens LGBTQ+ Elders in Housing.
Thank you so much for sharing, Renessa. It's exciting to hear about some of the work done to include LGBTQ+ people in these protected classes, to make sure that we are represented when it comes to claims of discrimination, not only in the state, but I know work is also happening nationally to support that as well. So thank you so much for sharing. And I will now toss it over to Kim to answer the same question. Just provide us a brief understanding of your work and how it connects to this important conversation of LGBTQ+ older adult housing. Welcome, Kim.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Thomas. Thanks so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. I've been introduced to SAGE several years ago. I've been working in senior living for over 30 years. And even before I started working in senior living, I was volunteering. So I started volunteering at a retirement community when I was about 13 or 14 years old, and I haven't looked back since. So I've had just about every single job you could have in a retirement community, from the really yucky jobs to some of the more fun jobs. And so I feel like I have a lot of experience with seniors in particular. And about 17 years ago, I started working for an organization who began developing affordable housing and started down the path of learning the ins and outs of affordable housing development. And I've been working for the last 17 years in developing affordable housing for seniors and for people that are transitioning out of homelessness. And I also was a board member for the Montgomery County LGBT Business Council for several years. And I've done a lot of advocacy for adults with disabilities, children with disabilities, and the LGBTQ community as well. And I'm super excited to talk more about the housing piece later on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kim. We are so excited to have you and just your wealth of knowledge and expertise from the housing world that you bring to this conversation. So thank you so much for being here. And last but certainly not least, I will toss it over to Ephraim.
Thank you, Thomas. Hello, good morning, everyone. I don't know if you can tell, but dawn is just breaking over here, so I'm very grateful for the sun that you've sent our way at this time, but I'm so happy to be here this early morning. But as Thomas had illustrated, my foundations were primarily in geriatric nursing, specifically in dementia and hospice, and that rounded out nearly a decade before I pivoted to work for Open House, which has been one of the greatest joys and loves of my life. Open House specifically is an LGBTQ+ senior center right in the heart of San Francisco. We're going to be celebrating 25 years this spring. And we tackle the needs of our community kind of trifold. There's the community engagement element, which I kind of see as the heart of the community. But then the more kind of substantial, life-affirming elements of the organization sit with the support services, which are our hands and feet. That looks like our housing units, that's our housing retention, our crisis management. And then there's my department that I oversee, which are the strategic partnerships. And it's exactly that, which is what it's in its name. It's strategic. It's all about the strategic relationships of our neighbors and nonprofit, both locally and nationally. And we're really just trying to leverage our unique expertise to best serve our aging population, to ensure that we not only age with dignity, but that we also die with dignity in the communities that we helped build. So we have multiple housing units on either side of the community center. We house about, I think there's 121 units to be exact, but we just announced plans to initiate and begin construction of a 240 unit high rise around the corner of the campus, which we're with plans to create an aging district, which is just, I'm just so thrilled to be a part of this project. And so Open House has become a lifeline, not only for obviously the community that it serves, but for those of us that are a little bit on the younger end of the spectrum that get to become the figurative children for the aging community that has really allowed us to be the flamboyant beings that we are, kind of just frolicking about as we serve the elders. And then my connection with Pennsylvania, I was born and my early childhood was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, before I moved out to the sticks of Lititz, where I spent most of my coming of age years. I had a really rich childhood, completely surrounded by all of the Amish farms around my home, with the smell of manure every single morning. And so, my father and mother gained refugee status in the mid 80s from Ethiopia. And so they landed and ended up in Lancaster, which I think reminds them a lot of home, just the kind of some of the rural elements of certain parts of the county. And so, my family's still there. My father, my mother, my brother, my sister are all still in Lancaster. And I actually gained my nursing degree there before I ended up moving to Philadelphia, where I spent a few years before trekking all the way out here to the West Coast. And so, far from home, but never forgotten. And I will be visiting in a couple months. So after this conversation, if you're like, hey, that's someone I want to connect with, please reach out. And if anyone in the chat knows if Shady Maple's still open, I haven't been there in over a decade. So, okay, yes, I will be going there. Absolutely, a must have to go there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ephraim, for sharing. Very exciting to hear about some of the work that's happening over on the West Coast, and just really glad that you're bringing your expertise and experience working in this niche LGBTQ plus older adult housing space to this conversation. So thank you so much for being here. We are going to now start talking some about this work, this important work, LGBTQ plus elder housing. What does it mean? And to start, I would love to know, in each of your lines of work, what sort of current innovative advocacy efforts are happening on behalf of this niche part of the community. Like LGBTQ plus older adults are here in need of services. And so what's happening in your worlds to support this community? And I'll just toss that to the whole group so anyone can jump in.
I can start. So one of the things that's interesting, as I was listening to Ed and Jim during their presentations, talking about affordable housing versus maybe market rate housing, one of the things that would stand out is, while there are not federal protections for the LGBTQ community, there are protections through HUD. HUD has really done some pretty interesting work in stepping out and creating opportunities for property managers to be able to have space and knowledge and expertise on how to manage people with regard to gender identity to begin with. Also, some other areas that HUD has made some inroads through property management would be through the changing of public restrooms from men's rooms and women's rooms to a single use restroom, and through some of the collected information with regard to applications and some of the background checks that are required to be done on folks before moving into an affordable community, changing paperwork, changing documentation, and ensuring that every person that comes and fills out an application for an affordable community is doing so by is filling out and is comfortable in filling out and providing information, and not mandating certain information be included in the application. And so there are some pieces like that that are happening through HUD.
And we've actually, thank you, Kimberly, for that. The PHRC has worked with HUD in the past and continue to partner with HUD on training individuals, training corporations, training, property managers, landlords. I would like to see us get into more of the smaller mom and pop landlords, but we basically provide, training on what discrimination looks like. The overt discrimination has sort of been, since the law, PHRA is existing, it's sort of died down, but we have the systemic barriers that still exist that, affect the person's ability to get a loan or, provide accessible housing or receive accessible housing. And so we've worked with the HUD before, and also currently we accept complaints. And then if we investigate complaints and we are able to find enough evidence to show discrimination against, we then provide training ourselves and we also provide training to anyone who requests through our website, phrc.pa.gov. And so we're now trying to formulate a more tighter bond with the LGBTQ community partners to reach out to different organizations and see how we can increase our outreach. But we've definitely made some strides with, like I said, the amending of our regulations to include LGBTQ status as a protected class, and already join it with the protections which exist against discrimination in housing. So.
Really incredible, Vanessa. I think when it comes to all of the models and initiatives that I'm seeing nationally, that these models are being adopted quickly, but I think Pennsylvania will be a very interesting demographic to kind of push through, just because I don't have to tell this group how varied the rich cultures and just like the cultural tugs that exist in Pennsylvania. And so I think all of the approaches, because let me back up for a moment. In San Francisco, Open House is really trying to design this model that is self-sustaining. We've created an adult day program that's embedded within the campus. We've introduced PACE, which is a national federal healthcare program that anyone can access as long as you're 55 years and older and you are low income. You should check to see if you're eligible, because they'll bring that kind of clinical care into the home so that you can stay independent for as long as possible. And so while these models are really great in these urban settings, I think because of how vast the richness is in Pennsylvania, you're going to have to be much more targeted about these approaches. When I'm thinking like going from Pittsburgh, someone mentioned that they're from Erie, and then you're going to Lancaster. I think the more local attempts, I know in Lancaster, I think it was in July that they opened Hearts, where I think it stands for Homelessness Emergency Assistance and Response Team, which is a part of the LGBTQ+ coalition. So these really unique cultural fits for the demographics that you're trying to approach, you're going to have to be much more targeted and intentional than how the urban settings kind of create this model that they want to try to apply at a national scale.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful to hear from all of you on that, and really interesting to hear about the work happening in Lancaster as well. Ephraim, I did not know of that work happening. But thank you so much for sharing all of that. Kim, I especially want to highlight the piece you talked about even the intake forms that people fill out are a way that LGBTQ+ people can either feel included or feel a separation from the community that they're entering into. And so noticing what is the language that we're using, what are the questions that we're asking, how are we creating a space from the beginning of this person coming into this community to really be inclusive of whoever is coming into this community. And so I think that's a really important point to think about, especially as we think about developing housing or we think about serving people with housing needs. Like, what are are those very first steps of entry that people have, and how are we making them more inclusive to people as well? Any last minute thoughts on that question before we move on to the last? I'd love to continue. Yeah, Ephraim, I see.
I would just add, just to expand a little bit more, I think, when I think about specifically rural Pennsylvanians, or LGBTQ plus older adults more specifically, there's an incredible isolation from the resources that people are trying to access, right? Like if you're in Philadelphia, this probably a little bit more resource rich than what you might experience elsewhere. And so thinking about either more intergenerational models so that there's a higher concentration of individuals that can be served in those more rural communities, or kind of flipping on its head, rather than even trying to create these curated, what's the word? Congregate settings, I guess. A lot of rural Pennsylvanians may already own homes, and there's no desire to leave the homes that they've fostered and cared for their entire lives. So rather than employing more on the housing element, rather thinking about like transportation resources so that there's an interconnectedness between rural communities that might be further apart. So there's like a legislative push, just like Kim was talking about before, that we would have to think about.
And I just wanted to add too, that a lot of times with organizations, we look at the bigger picture, we look at how we can impact communities, we look at the systemic piece. But at PHRC, when a complainant is successful in their investigation, we obtain remedies that are individual to them, like giving them the housing or allowing them to have the housing, or the monetary award for humiliation, embarrassment, emotional damages, what they would have received had they not been discriminated against. So even though, yes, we're addressing education on a grander scale, there's individual remedies that still are considered housing advocacy. And it's really energizing and sort of relieving to be able to follow through and see an investigation through to its end, where a complainant walks away and they're made whole again as much as possible. So I just wanted to bring that up as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And I think the points you all bring up are so important. Thinking about the difference, Ephraim, between the rural LGBTQ plus older adult community versus the urban LGBTQ plus older adult community, and recognizing there are different needs and different desires within those communities, and we cannot make assumptions. Just because we might exist in urban settings, we can't make assumptions about what these community members want or need. And thank you also, Renessa, to sharing with us about some of that work of fully following through with a case and what an individual is able to receive from your services as well, because I think that is a beautiful point. It's one thing for us to think about these higher level issues, and it's another for us to be able to give someone the housing that they need in this moment. So I really appreciate that conversation, and we're gonna transition a little bit to our next question, if that's okay with everyone. But in housing related work, and really in advocacy and community work in general, we talk a lot about the community being involved in the process. There's this phrase that gets tossed around a lot, nothing for us without us, which essentially is just meaning that we can't really plan or do things for a community if the community is not at the table, and ultimately if the community is not at the center of the table. And so I'm curious how you all see the older adult LGBTQ plus community being involved in this field of housing advocacy. Do you see it in your work? Do you have examples of it? Do you have dreams of what it could look like? And I'm also curious about what your thoughts are on why it's important to bring the community with us along the way as we're doing this work, because it is one thing for us to say that it's important. It's another thing for us to practice it and believe it in our work, in our life. So I know it's a big question, but I'd love to hear from y'all. I'll just toss it out to all of you. So whoever wants to get started can do so.
Well, I do want to jump in and add an African proverb which states, the lion's story will never be told if the hunter is the one to tell it. So we need to hear from the lion, not the hunter. At the PHRC, before we presented the amendment to the regulations, we did an LGBTQ listening tour where we invited different communities across the state, individuals, LGBTQIA individuals, to come in, let us know how impactful amending our regulations would be to include, the protected class that would cover more than just male or female. We have advisory councils in various communities across the states where we invite community members to form a group, and which would allow us as an agency, a state agency, to be connected to what's going on in the community, to be able to partner with organizations, LGBTQ+ organizations, and really any grassroots organization that would be able to be our eyes on the street, allow us to connect our services to what's actually needed. It's important that we allow individuals who are in this community to be at the table, because how would we be able to help them? It's one thing to be allies, but we need to know, what exactly is it that you need? What exactly are the issues you're facing? An outsider cannot tell an insider what they need to feel better, or what they need to be able to live free from this discrimination. And so while we have our Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, and we've done this work for quite a long time, the agency has been around since 1950s, we still touch in with the communities, and we still reach out to those and invite them to join our advisory council, invite them to participate in our listening tours. And yes, if you would like to become a part of the advisory council, you can go to, our PA Fair Housing line. You can call that, and I'm going to put this in the chat as other members talk, at 855-866-5718. And also you can reach out to PHRC's Fair Housing and Outreach Coordinator, Brittany Mellinger, at bmellinger@pa.gov. And again, I will put this in the chat, but it's important that we hear from individuals in the community. It's imperative.
Yes, I echo everything that you've just said. I think, we can perform anything. We can build anything for the sake of performance, and it could look good and it can feel good that we did it. But if we truly want these models or like these services and these housing initiatives to actually be successful, we have to be intentional about the approach. And that means engaging the community, because when you engage the community, you get a buy-in and there's a sense of shared responsibility. I mean, as a younger person, I've relied on our elders to have built the community that we live in. And how is it then at this point, then we would completely disregard their input and their guidance and how these communities should look and how they should be built? And that really just speaks to, obviously, the pervasive ageism that exists in this country. And I really implore anyone who is yet to maybe identify as an old person yet, because time hasn't caught up to them, I think, really exploring for yourself if this is a society that you truly are excited to be an old person in. And I think the ways in which we make these individuals invisible is just, I just really, it's just a call. I mean, I'm incredibly passionate about it because I think being Ethiopian American, we just have a very different approach with our aging population and our elders and the way that they are respected. And I just think that buy-in is so important. And yeah, so I think that's all I really had to say. Sorry, I kind of went on a little bit of a tangent.
So I'll piggyback on what Renessa and Ephraim said. My experience coming from not just being a developer, but also being responsible for property management in market rate retirement communities, as well as affordable communities, kind of having this unique kind of bird's eye view of what it's like to actually live there and what residents actually experience without having the voice of the person who's having the experience. Just like Renessa said, hearing the story from the hunter's perspective, you're never going to get the full story, right? You need to have both sides of the story there. And, one of the big conversations that everybody's having right now is equity, right? It's the hot topic. And so the first question with equity is who's not at the table, right? That's the first question. If you want to be equitable, who's not sitting at the table? And so the first question is, do we have someone that's talking to us? And I think one of the ways, I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, Thomas, so forgive me for that, but I get a little bit excited. One of the ways that we could potentially do something like that is that, it's one thing to build a building, right? We call that bricks and sticks. Okay, great. So we built a building and it's beautiful and it's fun and that's great. But, the piece that happens inside, how do residents feel when they live there? How are residents interacting with each other? In Pennsylvania, there are 2 opportunities for training And, perhaps that's this is where I'm getting ahead of myself, Thomas, sorry, but perhaps that's an opportunity to be able to make some inroads in differences in how people are treated in communities and how people feel in communities. One of the other big terms next to equity is culture change, right? And so that's a big topic in a lot of retirement communities. We need culture change. And what does that mean exactly, right? And so, perhaps by creating opportunities through some of the larger training organizations in Pennsylvania for market rate development of retirement communities and property management of retirement communities is Leading Age PA, and reaching out to Leading Age PA and creating, a cultural competency curriculum with Leading Age PA that can help in market rate communities have the conversation about making sure that people feel comfortable from the jump in the marketing materials, in the application, in the information that we're collecting as people come in. That's in market rate, obviously different than what some of the HUD buildings are, and then perhaps hitting the same type of program by hitting the group in Pennsylvania that helps train property management employees is Penn Del Ama, which is subsidiary of NAMA, the National Affordable Housing Management Association. And so, like I said, getting developers on board is one thing. And then, but the real meat and potatoes is at the level of the community. So, getting the buy-in from the people that are actually running the building, I think, is an opportunity for us to be able to make some changes that are meaningful.
Thank you, Kim. I would also add, like to your point about who's missing from the table, I'm really curious how many of our elders are even on the boards of the organizations and the advocacy groups that are doing this work. And when we think about, the aging experience, pulling in the disability activism would be powerful. I think a lot of, ultimately for most of us, assuming we live a long life, disability is kind of an inevitable experience of life. It's just going to naturally be a part of the aging process. And so if these two activist groups came together and formed some mega, it would be unstoppable. But I think sometimes the identification of being disabled, sometimes we don't realize that in fact we are disabled at this point in our lives, and really taking that on would be super powerful. So board representation is really specific, and then advocacy through our local senior centers. I know that in Lancaster, I think Loop just opened up over the summer, and that would be, I think, it's just in its beginnings. And so really like showering upon these organizations as they begin to butt up in smaller towns in Pennsylvania, and really empowering them to grow and then become funded, and then potentially build these contracts with cities and developers, and just really kind of getting that traction to move forward to then build the communities that you're looking for. Someone also mentioned in the chat the element of the intergenerational housing. I also really love this idea, because you're right, whoever, I don't have the name right in front of me, but someone was like, we kind of sequester our elders in this kind of corner away from the rest of society. And I'm telling you, when I came across Open House, it was because I was on an Indeed page looking for a job. I had no idea there was a senior organization serving LGBTQ plus individuals. And so like, when I first came into this community, I'm like, I could not believe I was seeing myself reflected in an older person. It was just something I was so divorced for. And there's many reasons for that, but ageism, I'm sure, plays a role in that. So this intergenerational element will be so healing for the community, because we are also seeking those connections with our elders. And I think it's invaluable, the kind of generational wealth, maybe not in a literal sense, but like through knowledge and wisdom that can be passed down to us by literally living in the same quarters. So I think it's a fascinating idea.
And Kimberly, you spoke about cultural competence, and Ephraim, you just gave a great example of how we cannot assume, even if we are culturally competent or we take training or we're around someone, we still can't assume that we know what that group needs. There needs to be someone from the group on the table so that we don't stereotype within our cultural competency. So we shouldn't say, oh, well, old elders want to live just by themselves. No, maybe they want to have some youth around. Maybe there isn't an older person that doesn't mind the pitter patter of feet, over their head. But then there's someone who's like, listen, I've earned the right to not want that child above me. So it's I think it's even professionals and people tied to these grassroots organizations and people so in touch with what's going on, we still can't assume that or think that we know everything, because we don't, as culturally competent as we all may be. Even belonging to the LGBTQ group myself, I don't know everything, and I wouldn't assume to be in a position to say, no, this is what you need, this would be a remedy for you, this is how I can fight for you. I need you to tell me exactly what it is you need, and that's how I'm an ally. So thank you, Kimberly and Ephraim, because those were excellent points.
Yes, thank you all for those beautiful and wonderful answers and thinking about what it really means to have the community present in this conversation. And I appreciate all that you brought to the table. I'm thinking a lot about what you just said, Ephraim, too, about how the older LGBTQ plus community like really paved the way for so many of us to exist in the space that we are today. And so what it looks like to honor this community, to not make this community invisible in so many ways that ageism and homophobia and transphobia is doing that already. And so I'm thinking a lot about that. I'm thinking a lot about that proverb you shared, Renessa, that is such a quick but potent way to describe like what we're trying to get at. And so I very much appreciate you sharing that as well. And Kim, I love the ideation of what could we do? What could we build? How could we make these spaces more inclusive for people? And how could we bring more people from the community to the table in this conversation, whether it's at market rate housing developments, whether it's at affordable developments, wherever it is. And so I really, really appreciate all of your answers. We are going to pivot to our final question today. The time has moved so fast and I'm just in awe of that. But I want us to take a step back for a minute, and I want to hear from each of you because you have such beautiful perspectives and insight on this work. But when you envision a more equitable housing landscape for LGBTQ plus elders in Pennsylvania, what do you see? What are you envisioning? What are you hoping for? And what would it take for us to get there? And I'd love to hear from each of you on this as well, if you're willing to share. And I don't know if this is putting you on the spot, but Ephraim, do we want to start with you this time, maybe?
Sure, no problem.
Okay.
You know, I find it's almost like shocking how much movement has been made even since I've, the blip of time that I've been here on this planet and this rock hurtling through space. And I think that, while the landscape is really incredible, I think the visibility is very apparent. I think the conversations continue to make us very visible, but it's still so devastating how much we're banging our head against the wall to be seen and to be understood and to have our needs met. Because even in San Francisco, we are spoiled, and yet still it falls short of the significant needs of our community. And so really, ultimately, I think the way forward is absolutely through legislation, which I'm echoing Kim's points, I think in her first or second answer, because the Commonwealth, it's home to these two massive cities. We have both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. They're massive. They're really progressive, large cities. They're fantastic. But then oftentimes there's this overshadowing effect that just naturally happens because these smaller traditional, we have Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish cultures and these post-industrial towns that are adapting and learning how to kind of maneuver in this, just this new era that we're in. And so these deep kind of regional, and I think I mentioned, did I say cultural? I think I said cultural tugs earlier. It's just, this has been a state that's often been colored purple on electoral maps. And I think our governor ends up changing maybe every 8 years, but we have a firm Republican legislature. And this isn't, it's really important for me to not make it about like this Democratic or Republican kind of element. But I think when we're thinking about making sure that we have the rights that we need, there is legitimate legislation we have to push forward. I know that the Movement Advancement Project, I think in partnership with SAGE, had a map that 35% of Pennsylvanians were fully protected. That leaves a massive amount of the population that has no protections. There's actually no middle ground. It's literally, you're either experiencing all these protections or you don't have any of these legitimate housing and discrimination protections. And so really pushing both at the local and then of course the federal level for legislation, voting, all of those things are really powerful. But of course, your local organizations are going to be your kind of pilot place to push that. There was a comment about faith-based organizations, and I know I understand the tension that exists there. I am a preacher's kid. I left the church a long time ago and I never looked back for very legitimate harm that happened. I was put into conversion camps and everything. That harm cannot be moved, you just can't ignore it. But depending on the community that you're looking at, when you're thinking about Black LGBTQ older adults specifically, there is a prominence of faith. And so working with the churches in those communities to meet them where they're at and then gain access to those communities through those local churches is just going to be your best bet. And so ultimately, while our individual struggles and experiences with certain avenues can be, there might be some harm around that. I think we just have to throw everything against the wall to really codify this legislation and get people served and protected.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Ephraim, and thank you for sharing about your personal experience and ties to this work and how important it is for you as well. And just thank you for being here today. We're so grateful. And I'm gonna now toss it over to Kim to offer some of her insights as well.
Thanks, Ephraim. You said quite a bit of what I wanted to say, so I'll kind of merge into where you were, right? Well, that's good, right? We're on the same page. So, one of the things as a developer that is very interesting is very much the difference between urban and suburban development, right? And so when we talk about buildings that are existing or creating new housing, the ability to be able to create housing that is inclusive like that becomes extraordinarily difficult the further out we get from an urban center. And so one of the opportunities is, something that I can talk about, something that I've been doing that I think probably makes sense to do on a more broad scale is working within the counties themselves in the county government, trying to work with the planning commission, trying to work with the housing and community development folks, having conversations about them speaking to municipalities. As soon as a developer walks in the room, I know there's a bunch of us on here, but as soon as a developer walks in the room, the municipalities pretty much shut down. They're not really that interested. If I say the word apartments, I shut out half of them. If I say affordable housing, I've got 75% of them out. And if I say disabilities, LGBTQ, now I've got like one person in the room that's even willing to talk to me, right? So each time I put a layer in, they're not that interested. And so, having the opportunities to have these conversations without the developer in the room, that the counties can have these conversations, and county government is a little more equipped to be able to have those conversations with those folks. It's not as even if that's not your intention, it's not as confrontational. It's more like, hey, make sure that you're paying attention to this. The board that I sat on, the Montgomery County LGBTQ Business Council, one of the things that one of the really pieces of cool kind of initiatives that we worked on there is these municipal ordinances being passed for local protections while we're waiting for the state to catch up. So, having an opportunity to have these local ordinances passed and then be able to go have those conversations there. These are conversations that can happen ahead of time so that when somebody comes in and wants to, move forward with this, having the county hit them, having smaller grassroots organizations hit them, then they're constantly getting this information more than just, they're prepared when somebody comes in and says, this is what we want to do. It's not a new conversation for them. And I think, the more people hear it, the more people are exposed to it, the more comfortable they become having the conversation, even if the first conversations are horrible, right? It has to start somewhere. And so I think, that's where I think there's opportunities for us to be able to make some inroads, because we've got to find a way to meet Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. We've got to find a way to get in the middle, right?
Thank you so much, Kim, for sharing, especially your unique experience that you bring to the table with housing. And what I hear from both you and Ephraim already is this push for like policy, but not just policy on a national and state level, but also locally. And I think that touches back to this piece of what it means to be really tapped into the community that you're trying to serve. And sometimes going at that local level and really listening to what people are needing and pushing for policy at that level can be a really helpful avenue to get some of this work done and across. And like Ephraim said too, partnering with organizations who might have a real tap into what the community needs as well. If it's churches, if it's community centers, if it's senior centers, whatever it might be. But I'll toss it over to Renessa to finish us off.
Well, Ephraim and Kimberly didn't leave much for me to speak about, but yes, legislation, Ephraim, yes. Kimberly, having someone on the board, the local planning board, just having representation there. And just to bring it back to my purview is in education, educating, realtors, landlords, lenders on their fair housing rights responsibilities, educating the public, educating LGBTQIA+ elders on how to fight for their rights, what recourses are available, what does exist on the local and the state level, because we do have protections on the state level under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, how to file a complaint with the PHRC, what kind of things do you need? Being able to remember names, maybe jot down who you spoke with, what happened, why do you believe that you're being discriminated against because of your sexuality, because of your gender identity, transgender identity, what types of words were said, code words, whistleblower, all those things. We want to empower the individuals to know how to fight for their rights so that we can go after those who are committing this discrimination and get the message across that it's no longer accessible. That yes, we're fighting it on a systemic level with lending and fair housing and accessible housing, but also on an individual level where you simply can't turn away a same-sex couple because whatever, because of discrimination or bias or whatever's wrong with you. So I'm fumbling over my words here just because Ephraim and Kimberly said it so eloquently, but I think it's all of it, on a higher level, the major scene, and also on an individual scene. We need to make sure that people are empowered and educated on what recourses are available for them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Renessa, for sharing that as well. I'm feeling empowered to educate myself after that, so I appreciate you sharing. And I think that piece of education, not only for us as individuals, but for community members, is so vitally important. So I'm really excited to get to open the three of y'all up to questions from the audience as well. So we're going to take a little time for some questions. Just like last time, if you have a question for Renessa or Kim or Ephraim, post it in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself, come on camera and say your question out loud if that is comfortable to you as well. We're going to take just a few minutes to do this, so I will pause now and let folks ask their questions. I already see something in the chat. I think it kind of touches to what you just said, Renessa, about education and educating ourselves on how to fight for our rights. But in the chat, Jeff said, in terms of education, is there printed material or instructions of what to do if one is facing discrimination or feeling like they're facing discrimination?
Yes, if you go to our website, phrc.pa.gov, it should be user-friendly. It says how to file a complaint. It looks at, it sort of talks about comparators and similarly situated, and it provides you sort of a step-by-step, at least on how to file the complaint with us. And then once you get in contact with an intake investigator, that intake investigator will ask you questions about, well, what have you seen? What did you experience? What do you have any evidence? Do you have any documents or correspondence on that we can use to substantiate what you're stating? And then you receive that education as you go through the complaint process with an investigator with the PHRC. So phrc.pa.gov. Thank you. Our director of housing, Adrian Garcia, just dropped the link in the chat, and so thank you, Adrian, for that. that's where you'll find that instructions.
Thank you, Renessa. I see another question here from Brittany. It says, what are ways that housing communities are coordinating mental health awareness in with activities or programming? Which is such a good question, such an important question. So I will toss that one out there now.
You want me to jump in, or Renessa, did you
Sure.
have something you want to add? I didn't know if
Anyone can.
Renessa wanted to add something. Okay, I saw Renessa off of mute. I didn't know if she wanted to add something. So I'll speak to it from two different backgrounds, because market rate housing is very different than affordable housing. So I want to speak to it just briefly from two different places. So as far as affordable housing goes, most communities in Pennsylvania that are affordable are either HUD or tax credit. And in both of those buildings are employees who are support employees there specifically to provide services and resources to residents who live there. And so mental health is typically a large component, not just for the LGBTQ community, but for many of the residents who live there. And so being able to provide those services, it does happen, but it's probably more quiet and on the side. And so unless there are specific apartments that are set aside specifically for people with mental health issues, typically there are relationships that are had and partnerships that can be had with support service agencies to provide kind of like this wraparound support for people who are living there. Outside of that, I would say that the person probably, number one, the resident would need to ask, right? So there's that, the resident would have to ask, but there are opportunities for these services to be available. In market rate, you have social workers and activities folks and nurses and all people who are prepared to have those conversations, psychologists and psychiatrists that are providing medication and things like that if we're talking about senior communities. I know I've seen a lot about having mixed communities with 18 and up, but if we're speaking from senior specifically, in those communities, there probably is a lot of resources. Again, the person has to be able to ask, has to be comfortable asking, but there are services available for people who do ask for it.
Yeah, I would add, thank you, Kim, for that. I would add that I think a lot of our models, even at Open House, it's not nearly enough what's happening specifically in mental health. Yeah, and yeah, definitely. I think we all know that there's not nearly enough. I know we just introduced PEARLS, which is an evidence-based program. I think it started out in Oregon, which is just short to midterm therapy sessions. It's not, it's a starting point for us. But I think so many of us think about the mental health element through the support groups and the connection that combats the pervasive isolation, but ultimately and unfortunately, so much of the mental health support sits at the feet of our support services staff, which are already overburdened with the state of what the pandemic has done to our aging community. And so I don't know what the answer is. It's nowhere near where it needs to be. I mean, a certain percentage of our housing units are COC for formerly incarcerated and houseless individuals. And so oftentimes there might be people experiencing psychosis or experiencing crisis. And it's just everyone kind of has to, literally anyone, whether it's a director or a support services staff, just drops what they're doing to support and mitigate this person. And working in tandem with the property management and really trying to support this individual to make sure that their housing retention is still, is still solid. But there's a long way to go. I don't know to be honest, I don't know what the answer is, but I think we have to fight for that funding to be able to properly support the individuals, because I think this is one element that has kind of been missing from that solid push. I think there's a beautiful model elsewhere. It's just that one element that doesn't have that legitimate plug in there.
And in Philadelphia, we have the Philadelphia City Council has Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services. And like Ephraim, like you said, they often work with landlords and property owners to obtain housing for those who are formerly incarcerated or who previously experienced homelessness, who are in recovery. And they, as part of that housing, contract, they may ensure that mental health services are provided, that the resident is keeping up with their counselor or, their drug and alcohol programs. And so there are some out there. We do need to see mental health services expanded, especially, because they're so hand in hand. I mean, mental health is everywhere, and we all have our own mental health abilities. And so I think that it needs to be incorporated in everything that we do when we're addressing, especially discrimination piece.
Thank you all for sharing on that. We've got another question in the chat from Ricky. It states, how can we assure that LGBT culture is incorporated in these projects? Which is a great question. And there's a lot to be said. So I will toss that to y'all.
Okay, I'll jump in. I won't take too much time, but one element is to partner with a local organization so that they can vet whatever it is. And this could be a wide variety of services. It could be housing units, it could be a long-term care facility. For example, at Open House, a part of my department is the Training and Transformation Department, where we, provide trainings, et cetera, and we provide that kind of technical assistance, but we also vet, and we have kind of an assessment tool where we vet these organizations and these housing units, and we essentially cold call, and I pretend like I'm bringing in my gay uncle and kind of just go through that. So if your local organization doesn't have anything like that, we do kind of a train the trainer program to get organizations kind of up to speed and be able to kind of go through our assessment tools and then be able to vet those organizations. And then you can kind of lean in on those local organizations to help you vet to make sure that cultural competence is present.
Thank you so much for sharing, Ephraim. Renessa or Kim, do y'all have anything to add to that as well?
The only thing that I would add is the same conversation that we had earlier, is making sure that the community has a seat at the table. That's the piece, right? So partnering with organizations like SAGE and Open House, but also making sure that the community where you're going to create the program, that people who live there have a seat at the table.
Absolutely. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'm seeing something in the chat. I'm seeing a couple comments. First, somebody just commented on the importance of developing awareness to trans elders living in Pittsburgh or Western Pennsylvania, which is absolutely so important. In so many of these spaces, in terms of LGBTQ plus equality, we oftentimes see trans and non-binary people becoming even invisible in these LGBTQ plus spaces. And so uplifting and ensuring that trans elders are included in this conversation is of the utmost importance. And to add on to everything that's been said in this panel and in our speaking conversations today, when we think about bringing the community to the table and we think about those things, it is so important that trans elders are at the table as well. And for us to remember that trans elders exist. I think to Ephraim's point about being able to see ourselves reflected in the communities that we're existing in. Like, I think so many times trans elders are made invisible. And so remembering and reminding ourselves in the communities that we're in that trans elders exist and that they deserve to have a seat at the table is so important. So I thank you for bringing that up in the chat. And we'll finish with this question from Aaron, which is similar to the question about working with mental health as it comes to this intersection of housing. But Aaron just asks about communities that work with agencies to support people with IDD or autism dual diagnoses. And Aaron is mentioning that they find typical housing lacks understanding that might support understanding the supports that might come along or be needed with these tenants. And so I don't know if anyone can speak specifically to type of housing that might be supportive for people with different diagnoses or neurodivergence, but I'd love for somebody to hop in.
Okay, it's the one that talks the most probably, but what I did not share at the beginning is that one of the reasons that I happen to be a fierce advocate for people with disabilities is that I have a son who has Down syndrome. And so I have a unique perspective as a lens that I look through as I'm doing property management, as I'm developing buildings, as I'm advocating for my son. And I've learned an awful lot over the last, he's 14, I've learned a lot over the last 14 years advocating for him. And what I would say is that that is absolutely a correct statement. There are buildings, communities that have spaces that are set aside for certain disabilities. Again, I'm gonna put a line down the middle. Affordable housing, if it's affordable housing and we have set aside units for people with certain disabilities, there will be services and supports there for those folks. However, the reality is that you're not going to have all of that information. And, you know, if you have an open community where you're not discriminating against people, you don't really know exactly who's moving in until they move in, right? And so you're going to get people that have different types of disabilities, especially in the mental health field, right, that you may not know when they move into the building. And so it does become somewhat difficult from the property management's perspective to be able to manage folks that you really weren't set up to manage to begin with, right? And so we talked about that culture change a little while ago, and Renessa has mentioned, you know, the county departments of behavioral health and developmental disabilities that would work with IDD and autism, you know, being able to have those relationships. And so, you know, I agree that it's not even across the board. It's not. Some communities have them, some communities don't. Some counties are better. Some counties have stronger supports, and it's kind of like it's not even. And so I do recognize that. But there are services that are out there.
And I'm sorry, Ephraim, please
No,
go.
I insist.
All I was going to say was disability is a protected class under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. And so if you find that you move into a place and you need a reasonable accommodation for your son, daughter, or for yourself, and a reasonable accommodation is just like an alteration of policies or you know, modifications where you need some type of accessibility to be able to live in that unit just as everyone else does. If you present and you make that request and you're denied or unreasonably don't receive an answer, then you file a complaint with us, with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And you say that I requested a reasonable accommodation based on my disability. I have not received an answer, or I received an outright denial, or I was evicted, or, you know, any of those things. We investigate those complaints. We do have a legal department that can sort of interject and provide an injunction to being evicted. So there's layers to being able to protect your rights, to being able to ensure that you can live in housing that meets your needs and that you're not discriminated against based on your sex, sexual orientation, your age, or your mental health or disability. And disability is physical or, you know, mental. So there are recourses available to you at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission to provide services for that.
I would also add to Kim's point, you know, I'm actually almost ashamed how little that is being explored in these models as we're continuing, because of course, like the deeper the intersections that we're looking at, the better it serves everyone. Because if we're tackling these deeper intersections, naturally everyone will be served as we kind of come up. And my parents were what they called house parents for an organization in Lidditz that served individuals with various kinds of autism and or Down syndrome. And I think we had 8 adults that I grew up with that we were serving. And it was exactly what you're saying, very sequestered, completely separate. There were complicated feelings about, you know, individuals going to a place to work for pennies on the dollar, really, you know, doing different types of jobs and tasks. And that was a very faith-based organization. So there was this kind of, a requirement for programming to be embedded with that that element of faith. And so there is a lot of movement. And again, I think it's just these awakening moments where, aha, like yet another individual who has been made invisible from the table. So I really appreciate whoever lifted this question up. And I so appreciate you, Kim, sharing your personal story as well. So I think that is really powerful. So yeah.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for question and answer. If you have a question that did not get answered, or if there's a question in the chat that was not touched on, please hold on to that question. We are going to go into breakout sessions after our break, and that might be a great opportunity to explore your question more with your breakout session group, to have more conversation about whatever is on your mind. Additionally, Sydney put our Sage emails in the chat earlier. So if you have continued questions after this conversation, please feel free to reach out to us. But I just want to thank again our panelists for this incredible conversation. Each of you has brought such wonderful expertise and experience to the table. And I wish that I was able to write down furiously so many of the things that you were saying, because there was just so much that felt rich and beautiful and wonderful. And so I'm just incredibly grateful and very, very glad that we got to hear from you all today. But now we are going to take a 10-minute break. So please mute your microphone, go off camera, stretch, go to the restroom, do whatever you need to do. And we will rejoin back together at 11:07. So at 11:07, make sure to be back on. At that moment, we will go into our breakout sessions to finish this last hour of the event. So we will see you all at 11:07. All right, everyone, we're going to gather back in about 1 more minute. So get what you need, and then we'll come back together in about 1 minute. Thank you. All right, we are going to get started again. I hope you all enjoyed a nice 10-minute break, that you were able to breathe and rest for a minute before coming back for our final hour of conversation. For our final portion of this event today, we are going to enter into breakout sessions together. When you registered for this event, there was a drop down in the registration that asked you if there was a topic you were more interested in talking about at this conversation. And so there were 5 topics you could choose from, and those are the topics for our breakout session. To review, these topics are first, social isolation and housing insecurity for LGBTQ+ elders. So that's our first breakout session, touching on how social isolation and housing insecurity intersect for this community. Our second is alternative housing solutions for LGBTQ+ older adults. So looking at different possible styles or models of housing solutions for the LGBTQ+ older adult community. Our third breakout session is training current housing and service providers in LGBTQ+ elder competencies. So what it looks like to train current service providers in these competencies. Our fourth breakout session is effective outreach strategies to reach LGBTQ+ elders. So what it looks like to really get in touch with and reach this community near you. And then lastly, our last breakout session is understanding and navigating the state's affordable housing processes as an LGBTQ+ elder. So navigating those processes. If you get into your breakout session and you recognize that maybe this isn't the topic you thought you chose, or you would like to change your mind, that's totally fine. Just come back into the main session and I'd be happy to put you in the session of your choice. And when you go into your sessions, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, feel free to hop off the meeting and log back on. It'll put you back in the main room and I'll just disperse you to your breakout session. When we go into our breakout sessions, your breakout session facilitator will introduce themselves and kick off the conversation. We ask during this time that you are respectful and considerate of all the people in your breakout session. And we are all here to learn from one another and to grow together. And we ask that we all be focusing on how we can share time and conversation space together. And like I said, if you're having any technical issues, feel free to just come back to the main session and we will try to figure things out. But we are about to be sent into the breakout sessions. So if you don't get sit into a session, that just means that your breakout room was never assigned based on your registration, and we'll figure out what room you need to go to when we send you out. I hope you all enjoy these conversations. When we finish the conversation, we will come back to the main session for a closing remark. And these sessions will last about 45 minutes. Enjoy your conversations, and thank you all so much for being here.